This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Harb.
If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. We are counting on you. Each week, we bring you interviews with authors of books, research, and other things that have caught our attention. This episode is the first in a special series sponsored by the German government. Germany will be holding the EU presidency in the second half of 2020. And with their generous support, the Tel Aviv Review will be holding a series examining Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries.
To that end, we're very pleased to start this series with Dr. Hadas Cohen. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of Law at Bar-Ilan University. She is a visiting researcher at the Davis Institute for International Relations at the Hebrew University, and she teaches at the Hebrew University too. She holds a PhD in political science from the New School University, a master's degree in human rights and international affairs from Columbia University, and she is a licensed lawyer. Her research interests include gender theory, identity, the construction of nationalism, patriotism, and the concept of treason, and she is applying the intersectionality of gender, race, and class to analyze these phenomena. But today, we'll be talking about a different area of research, no less fascinating and opposite: the phenomenon of Israelis who move to Germany. This is a chapter called Israeli Jews in the New Berlin, From the Shoah Memories to Middle Eastern Encounters, co-authored with Danny Krantz. Hadas, hello and welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, I should say.
Thank you. Hi, good morning.
So, why Berlin? How and why did this city in particular become a hotspot for Israeli immigrants, in light of all the complexities of immigration, especially to Germany, that we'll discuss momentarily? But why is Berlin the focus here?
Well, Berlin is a very cosmopolitan city, cosmopolitan and available economically to Israelis, that they don't have to make a lot of money to move there, and they could get by with very little. This is one, group of Israelis that are moving there. The other group of Israelis are academics, musicians, people who are doing things in the arts, and they're moving there because the German government is sponsoring a host of fellowships, such as my own. I went there to do research on Israelis who moved to Berlin, granted a postdoctorate research by the German government. And so this is right now an opportunity for people who want to pursue these professions that it's almost impossible in other places in the world to go to Germany and do that, and specifically in Berlin.
So you're saying it's not so much us, it's them. In other words, Berlin is an attractive place for a certain kind of people who want the support to do these artsy and humanistic pursuits. How can Berlin afford to do that? Those aren't money-making professions.
No, but the German government, again, has decided to allocate a very large sum of funding, basically, to support the arts and academia. And it's almost wanting to restore what they had once, this grandeur, like to go back to the time before the Second World War, which manifests in other areas as well.
Like what?
Like what? Like wanting, in a way, wanting to have Jewish people again. We saw when Russian Jews left the Soviet Union after immigration from there was possible, we saw almost a competition between Israel and Germany on who would give those immigrants better, economic opportunities or funding. And so this was, and the whole idea or the motivation, I believe, was wanting to have Jewish people again. And right now, what is happening also in regards with the Israelis, we see that this is almost a political, it's embraced politically in a way that is I think, as a researcher, astounding. When I was doing research to see if this project was even feasible, if there would be interest, I met with German diplomats in New York, and they said, yes, we would be very much interested in that. Right now, I saw further interest in that and the politically, which was fascinating how it didn't translate into any academic merits. I still had to go through the whole process of peer-reviewed applications and so on. But I believe that for the political strata, there is a lot of interest in creating some sort of a cosmopolitan Germany.
Going back to the profile of the Israelis who moved to Germany, do you think that it makes them a distinctive group sociologically as opposed to other Israelis who go elsewhere to pursue, I don't know, some sort of, financial benefits? Or
Of course. So the streets of Berlin are not, as we say about the streets of New York, for instance, are not lined with gold, right? It's hard. It's not easy to immigrate there because that even though the city is extremely affordable, they don't speak the language. And for those of them who do not have EU passports or EU citizenship or even German citizenship, it's quite complicated. Opening a bank account is complicated. You have to register at the city hall with your address. You have to go to the immigration office, and they speak mostly German there. There's no I don't know, it's not very accepting in that sense. So Israelis that move there really want to move there. And yes, if you're talking about their profile, if you're asking about their profile, the majority of them, as my colleague Dani Kantz did in a survey, the majority of them have at least a BA degree. In other words, they have at least one degree. They are about 80% Ashkenazi of Middle Eastern descent. While some of them are supporting themselves from what they do there, others have strong economic support from Israel, or they are funded by the German government. So you could say almost that it is some sort of not all, of course, but the people that are the group that I was looking at, it's an elite migration, because who can afford in a way to decide in their 20s or 30s that, I'm not going to go and build up my future. I'm going to go to Berlin for a few years to pursue my opera career or my conducting career. I interviewed there a conductor of modern classical music. These professions almost don't exist outside of places like Germany or Northern Europe. So, yeah.
Well, there's a very loaded history for two aspects of this. One is, of course, the Israeli and Jewish relationship with Germany and what does it mean for these young Israelis to go live in Germany. But the other loaded side of it is simply emigrating from Israel. Leaving Israel has a long history of being very emotionally and even legally sensitive. Can you tell us about the historic roots of what it meant to Israelis to move away from Israel in the early years?
Of course. So moving from Israel was branded as Yerida, meaning ascending. Descending, sorry, of course.
Okay.
And moving to Israel is ascending, yes. So descending, meaning you are leaving the place where you are placed high in terms of social status and in terms of meaning, or in terms of realizing your true self as a Jewish person in the world. So you leave that and you desert. You go somewhere else for mundane reasons, such as wanting to have a better life. That is not considered to be something. It was not considered to be something that was legitimate. So, but throughout the years, the attitude towards Israelis who immigrated from Israel has become much more lenient, forgiving, and it's very much accepted with the globalization in the 80s that basically also came to Israel as well. But going to Berlin, moving to Germany, seems to have that stigma that existed before the easing of the attitude. So I can give a personal anecdote. When I was doing my PhD studies in New York, when I told people in Israel where I'm living, it was always encountered with almost jealousy, appreciation. It's like, you made it. This is the way to live. When I told people in Israel, when I moved to Berlin for my postdoc, and I mentioned that I live in Berlin, almost always the reaction was almost the opposite. And then when I told him that the research that I was doing there about Israelis who moved there, the reaction was 99.9% of the time that they are traitors, that why did they move there and how could they do that?
And what years are we talking about where you were telling Israelis about this research?
2000, 13, 14, 15.
I just would like to confirm this experience by explaining to Israelis that when I moved to Israel in the late 1990s, the initial reaction was kol hakavod, good for you. But over the 2000s, I would say at some point it shifted to, why did you come here? You're from New York? Why would you come here? Like Israelis would say, gee, why would you give up what you have there to be here? So, I mean, I think it affirms what you're saying.
But going back to your analysis that is based partly on your own personal experience, I wonder why there was this easing of the pejorative context of Yerida in relation to New York and not so much
to the States, anywhere.
Or to anywhere other than the Germany. Is it really the memory of the Holocaust that is really the bone of contention?
Of course. If you look at any Israeli newspaper, or let's say the Israeli media, every day you have at least one mention of the Holocaust. This memory is still very much with us. So going to Germany to start a new life, to escape the Israeli chaos, to the place where the apocalypse started, where in Berlin, they concocted the final solution. This is not something that is still, until today, considered to be as laissez-faire, as something that is just legitimate and okay.
Okay, but there is a binary divide here. Okay, I was fascinated to read in your article that Israelis actually couldn't even enter Germany on an Israeli passport in the early years. That's what you're saying, this huge stigma. On the other hand, I'm going to put on my...
It's not stigma.
Israeli passport said valid to all countries except Germany.
And it was not a stigma. It was a legal, basically manifestation of a legal relationship, or rather a lack of a legal relationship between Germany and Israel. So
until 1956? Around then.
Yes.
Okay, so but there is a heavy symbolic weight to the law. In other words, it helps, instill this sense that Germany is not a place where Israelis are supposed to go. So I think that must have affirmed what you're both saying. On the other hand, my public opinion researcher hat, in that hat, I know from doing lots of survey research that Israelis generally view Germany as a very friendly and supportive country these days. So tell us about that schizophrenia.
Yes. Of course. There's the duality, right? And this is, we can place the context, and in this context, the efforts of Germany to, as I say this with quotes, huge quotes, bring our Jews back. So basically Germany has launched a huge apology project in which we saw the German president in the 60s or 70s, basically come and apologize in the Knesset. And we see a whole host of projects that are basically meant to support particularly Israelis. For instance, there is the Minerva Fellowship that is bringing Israelis to Germany and Germans to Israel, in exchange. So we have that is going on. And Germany, as part of wanting to become a part of the nations, the host of nations, the political strata decided that one of the ways to do that and to move on beyond what the Nazi Germany, and basically to erase that identity, was to help Israel and basically economically assist Israel. So we see that in that context as well. And after years and years of doing so, and we have to also remember that survivors are dying. So we are no longer during the Eichmann trial, where survivors were very much heard in court saying, the wound was quite raw then. So we are right now in a period where we have the grandchildren and even the fourth generation. So
do you think it's the influx of Israelis to Berlin is really, helping to normalize emigration to Germany, or is it still the memory of the Holocaust is still, holding us back?
Well, I think that it's not a yes-no question. So first of all, let me unpack that. There is no influx of Israelis moving to Germany. There are between 12 and 20,000. It's hard to quantify them exactly because some of the Israelis who enter Germany do not enter with an Israeli passport or a German passport, but rather they with a Polish passport or Portuguese. It's becoming more and more fashionable right now in Israel, or common to get.
They're getting a lot of press, though.
They are getting a lot of press.
And do we think the numbers are rising over the years?
We don't know that because, again, we did that. My colleague, Dr. Kantz, did that quantitative research in 2014, 2013. But since then, as far as I know, no one has been tracking the way that she was doing that. With Professor Uzi Rebhorn from the Hebrew University,
But even in
numbers.
2013 and 14, do we think that was a rise relative to 10 years before?
Of course, yes.
course.
Yeah. We saw after the big protests here in Israel at around 2012, 13,
11, yeah.
11, we saw where young Israelis were looking for a better life. Berlin offered some sort of for the Israelis that were willing to travel to Germany and were also economically able, as I mentioned before, or even just for a few years, those who decided to do that, Berlin offered an opportunity.
What about the policy of the German government to attract Israelis specifically? When did it start?
Well, so this was, again, I don't know exactly when it started, but it's a recent phenomena. And what is happening with that is that in a unique situation, Israelis are equal to immigrants from the U.S., Canada, Japan, and countries that do not require a special visa, that have easier access to fellowships. So unlike other countries where Israel is still between a first world and a third world country, here Israel is counted among the strongest and most economically wealthy country in the world.
Is it partly this lowering of the stigma, simply because, as you point out, the older generation of Holocaust survivors and their stories are not as fresh and prominent and simply are not as much of a burden on this younger generation? Is it because the younger generation their thinking is not as dominated by the traumatic memory of the Holocaust, and now they're looking at Berlin as a destination the way any other emigrants from other countries sort of seeking a cosmopolitan life and an adventure abroad might look at it?
Some, yes, but I think that we need to look at the social psyche of Israel as a more a non-homogenic one. You have, or the Israeli society, you have those that are still very much against any normalization of relationship to Israel, but they are becoming less and less given, again, that the generations are moving beyond, are getting younger or older. And you have also those that they just want, again, easily a better life. They want to experience. So Israel is in a way becoming more open throughout the years and more cosmopolitan in itself.
But are they forgetting the Holocaust history and memory, or are they simply not making their personal choices filtered through that historic filter?
Okay, so I think that what we see here is like a dual phenomena. So first, they're not filtering consciously, almost in a way, not filtering their decisions based on the history of the Holocaust. But when I interviewed them in Berlin, it took about between 1 to 5 minutes for the memories of the Holocaust to come up, of the grandparents, where they were. I mean, we'd start talking and many would say, oh, I'm beyond the Holocaust. I'm not even thinking about that. Oh, no. But then my grandmother was, and so. My grandfather escaped from within 5 minutes of conversation. So you see that this is still very much in the consciousness.
And also, as you point out, some of them put a positive spin on the apology effort, right? Saying, okay, now it's time to come back because of all the effort that Germany has made to accommodate us. So
I think this is actually an amazing effort that Germany has done that not only benefited us, but also benefited them as a country. When a country, after such a traumatic event, apologizes rather than suppresses it and comes and says, we owns what they did. We did that and we want to move on. Please forgive us. Not only are they granting the victims this recognition of what happened, there is a validation that, yes, the trauma did happen, but also for themselves, there is no need to suppress that trauma, to pretend like it didn't hurt anyone, to pretend like, oh, what is going on is not important, and we can live in this dual kind of an existence, which is extremely harmful because, as Freud said, everything that is repressed comes back, and you never know how it's going to come back.
Well, that's a very interesting personal psychological and psychiatric explanation, but there is also a very interesting literature on the politics of apologies in the collective context and national leaders trying to apologize for past wrongs to specific groups. And there's a wide-ranging sense of how effective they are. But to my mind, without systematically going through all of that literature, I have read some of it. And it seems to me that what Germany has really done is not just a one-time one-time apology, but a decades-long policy
Yes.
of trying to reestablish
Yes.
this relationship. Would you agree with
Yes,
that?
I completely agree. And yes, and I think that it benefits them. Again, it's there's also literature about the memory theater or theater of memory and what is happening. What do we remember? How do we remember things? Do we remember our own past in a way? So if you look at Germany, for instance, as an academic, I can't say that anything is unified, of course. So on the one hand, you have this overarching historical effort that has lasted for years to apologize and make amends. On the other hand, we have to remember that Germany, after the Second World War, after the Nazi regime, absorbed basically many of the Nazis, and the elite didn't go anywhere. A lot of the judges were judges during the Nazi regime were judges afterwards, politicians, diplomats, and so on. The bureaucrats that allowed the system to continue. At the same time, still having this kind of an effort and having this as the face of Germany is something that trickles down, and that I think is very healing for the nation on its own.
Well, one of the interesting things about this research is that you did it in conjunction. You, a native Israeli, did it in conjunction with a German researcher, Dr. Danny Krantz. And as you write in the article, in the interviews that you did, you got very different answers or approaches to some of the issues than she did as a German. Can you elaborate on some of those?
I'm going to pile on just for the technical question. I would love for you to explain, because I am a data nerd, how extensive your research was. There was really a lot of qualitative and quantitative. Can you explain the research and then answer Gilad's much more substantive question?
Yes. So basically, Dr. Krantz used surveys, and also she used census data to analyze and basically come up with the figures regarding how many Israelis lived in Berlin. And she had, again, questionnaires for the Israelis and also open-ended interviews that she and another German researcher did. And then I did that in conjecture. I mean, they did those interviews in English, and I did ethnographic work, which means basically not only interviews, but following the lives of Israelis and or tracing the cultural products that were produced in Berlin. So going to plays or going to panels that were held in Hebrew in Berlin. Almost every week there was at least one panel, or Talmud studies group, but a secular Talmud studies group that was going on there.
It sounds like more of a very Jewish existence than we sometimes feel here in Israel. I don't know of any secular Talmud studies groups that involve
Right.
Tel Aviv. There are some, but they're not nearly as unifying a feature for like what the community might do among
Right.
secular Israeli Jews.
Right. And what is one of the interesting things that I found there in Berlin is that, for instance, there was quite a large group of Israeli intellectuals that said, we are Israelis not because that we grew up in the country, in the geographical area of Israel, but because we speak Hebrew. So the idea was to define themselves through their language and allow that, or basically take their national identity from that. So this is one of the most interesting findings that I found there.
Yes, and now to the difference in their answers to your questions and to Danny Krantz's questions.
Well, so this, yeah, I know we wrote about that, and I think it's interesting how people narrate themselves in regard to when depending on the interviewer, right? So, with me as an Israeli, of course, they would have much less need to present themselves as successful or not, or this is. It's like you don't put up the persona that you do as you do to as somebody who is external or it does not belong to your group.
I wanted to ask you something about the political characters of this community. You said that 80% of them were Ashkenazi, is that
Yes.
correct? You also point out that many of them work in the arts, in sort of humanist professions, liberal arts or fine arts, and it sounds like many of them are left-wing.
Yes.
Explain why. Is Berlin a draw for left-wingers from other countries in general, including Israelis, or are left-wing Israelis who have particular criticism of Israeli society drawn to Berlin or drawn to leaving in general?
Well, I don't think that not drawn to leaving in general, the Israelis that are critical of Israel, because research has shown that actually Israelis diaspora, almost other than Berlin, are quite right wing, very nationalist, and supportive of Israel no matter what. But the Israelis that move to Berlin have to overcome a hurdle of going. I mean, the Israelis that say, "Oh, my feet will never step on German soil," those are like a self-selection. They will not end up in Berlin, right? So the Israelis that do move there and that, again, their families almost are in a way okay with that, or they don't give them such a hard time that they prevent them from doing that. They are much more cosmopolitan, open-minded, I believe. And yeah, so you definitely do have more, and usually that's more associated with being left-wing, critical of nationalism, critical of the idea of the chosen people, and so on.
But also it's a chicken and egg question, isn't it? Because these people who move there are in the arts already, which is, a sector of the industry that is, I would say, more attractive to left-wingers and, bohemian types than...
But not all of them. Not all of them, because you have some of the Israelis that move there. For them, it's an extended backpacking trip to India. Berlin is affordable. They can work there as bartenders or in restaurants or in whatever it is that they find work, and then just live with a few people in apartments and in a very affordable life. So it's they are also, but from what I found, the majority are quite indeed left-wing and cosmopolitan. Because again, you have to overcome this hurdle of, I will never go back to Germany. I'm like clinging on to this hate or to that part of my identity that sees Germany as an other.
As we said in the introduction, you're also interested in questions of gender.
Yes.
Does this perspective shed any light on this specific group, in terms of women, etc.?
Well, so when I was doing the interviews there, I noticed that Jewish Israeli women, particularly single that moved to Berlin, had a very different story. One of my interviewees that moved to Berlin in her late 30s, divorced, no children, said, the first time that when I came here, I finally realized that I'm normal. And she said that when she was living in the heart of Berlin in a huge loft with 7 other German roommates. Now, in Israel, that might sound very chaotic, but in Germany, that is very organized. I mean, even families sometimes share these Wege, these apartments. And she said she lived in a moshav before, and she didn't realize that there is a continuum in which some women are married, some are single and have children, and some are just single without children or live in partnerships. So this was something that if we look at Israeli society, one of the entering tickets to Israeli society is motherhood. And somebody that chooses, a woman that chooses not to have children, or just life happens and you don't end up having children, there is a need to explain that, because there is a policing that happens everywhere all the time without even people being aware that is happening. So moving away from that, Berlin offers Israeli women, again, single Israeli women, an opportunity to just get away from these social norms.
Why do men not experience the same thing? What if
in Israel?
Yeah, or single men without children who move to Berlin?
Because they are much outside of that grid of policing here in Israel to begin with. So going there, it's kind of much
less
easier.
liberating.
So basically,
Exactly.
the ticket to Israeli society, the what you called an entry ticket, is a woman-based motherhood, but it doesn't really apply to men who decide not to have children or who life doesn't somehow bring them to having children.
Well, with men, there is no biological clock, right? So the idea is that there's always
a possibility.
Exactly. Yes. There's always a possibility. While for women, it's much limited and there's much more pressure. And what I found there is that moving to Berlin for these single Israeli women, especially when they were in their 30s and 40s, was almost an act of resistance against these social norms and these expectations of having a very heteronormative lifestyle, even that exists even in Tel Aviv. I'm working right now on an article about that, and I'm going over my interviews with women, and this is some of the conclusions that are coming up.
And they express it like that? This is a sort of resistance against the sort of conservative, oppressive, conservative family, locked into a traditional family structure kind of society in Israel?
Well, no, none of them said the word resistance. That's actually my formulation about that. But what they have expressed is a lot of disdain and exhaustion with the pressure that they experienced here, and then moving to Berlin with all of the hardships and with all of the difficulties of going and doing that alone without family support. Still, it's something that they feel that it's a relief to be away.
Tell me something. Is this it's indicative of a bigger immigration pattern whereby all of the humanist, liberal-minded cosmopolitans find each other in whatever corner of the world, whether it's Berlin or some other city, and all the hardcore nationalists stay in their nations, wherever they are, and then the world just sort of self-segregates into major urban centers where people share similar values, and they all elect, leaders that they think suit their values, and everybody else elects some version of Donald Trump, and happily ever after. Is that the way the world is going?
Again, as an academic, I have to complicate this. I mean,
please complicate it, because even what I said is scary to me.
No, because people immigrate for different motivations. My original question when I started this research was, why do people immigrate? And then I realized it doesn't really matter why they immigrate. The question is what happens when they reach their destination. So people immigrate also for economic reasons. And if you look at, again, Australia, London, New York, San Francisco, LA, there is a huge Israeli enclave there.
But they're quite
right
different.
Wing. They're right-wing, right. So the motivation for immigration is different, and wanting to make money or
Silicon Valley types.
Yeah, better your economic situation. We see these groups as well. What is unique about the Berlin immigration is what was created on the ground once this tiny, tiny group reached there.
I'll try and reach a conclusion by asking you whether you think that Israeli immigration to Berlin is a case in point, in a way, shedding light on Israeli immigration writ large, or is it really an exception to the rule that allows us to, that doesn't allow us to make any draw any conclusions and wider conclusions?
I think it's a complete exception to the rule, and I think it's fascinating what is happening there. And just I'll demonstrate why I say that. So with Israelis that are moving to Berlin, the geographical location is very loaded, right? I mean, we had the Nazis starting their final solution there, and then the city was divided into two, into East and West, and as if it's the vengeance of the West was applied there in terms of punishing Germany. And then we have the Israelis that are coming there, and what they're doing there right now is almost drawing two vectors culturally. One is to Jewish Berlin before the Second World War, which was a very big cultural center with Hebrew language production of books, publication houses. For instance, Shoken was a publishing house then before coming to Israel. And so they're connecting to that. And there are some galleries that are opening just in Mitte, which was where a lot of that activity took place, as a way to revive the Hebrew or the Jewish culture, Hebrew-speaking Jewish culture from the beginning of the century. That's one vector that's going to the past. And another vector is as if not as if, but when Israelis are moving to Berlin, they're realizing that they're actually not European, these Ashkenazi Israelis, and I would say as an intersectionality researcher, also not white. They're seen by the Germans as Orientals, like from the East, right?
Even though 80% of them are Ashkenazi.
Yeah, they're not seen as
all
Ashkenazi.
From the Levant now.
Yes, completely. So what we saw, we saw there, and I particularly saw over and over, is that this connecting with other refugees that are coming or other immigrants that are coming from the Middle East. So a lot of joint projects, cultural events in which we see Syrian refugees. I mean, I saw Syrian refugees coming and joining project, or talks about
Talmud study?
No. Refugees in Israel. So a lot of peace work that is happening.
But as you're right, some of these Israelis who rediscover the Middle Eastern identity are taken aback by it, because growing up in Israel, there was sort of taught that they're not part of the broader Middle East, that they're a democratic, Western European outpost in the Middle East.
A villa in the jungle.
A villa in the jungle, exactly.
Right. And then they move there and they realize that actually actually know.
They see us as the jungle.
Yes.
No, but they see themselves as well. I mean, they realize that they're much more Middle Eastern than they had thought.
Yes. And actually what they have in common with somebody from Iran, from Syria, from Lebanon is much more than what they would have in common with a German in terms of the cultural warmth, in terms of the food, in terms of would you be invited to somebody's house or not? We take that for granted that you are invited to somebody's house. In Germany, no. It's one of the biggest gestures of intimacy if a German friend would invite you home.
And sure, of course, it often takes going abroad and becoming an expat, becoming a stranger to appreciate the people who are close to you, but not so close to you at home. I mean, I remember living abroad in a very obscure part of the world where all of a sudden I met some Palestinians and I said, where are you from? And they said, Palestine. I said, oh, I'm from Israel. And we looked at each other and we were happy to meet each other. It was like before we restrained ourselves, that was the first emotion that was clear because we were in this very obscure part of the world. Is that a normal dynamic?
This is something that happens, I think, this being in a neutral territory, that would happen also in New York and indeed abroad or away from Israel, away from that tense zone where you are in conflict, and the conflict basically informs your life. But in Berlin, there's almost as if the next step is also taken because there are a lot of this tiny population, a lot of cultural projects that are happening together with a group of maximum of 20,000 people.
Right. Well, so that we say halavai. Dr. Hadas Cohen, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
And thanks to Itai Shalem, our producer, and again to the German government for their generous support for sponsoring this series on Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. It's in the ratings and review section. We take all kinds, critical, supportive, we take worshiping reviews, anything you like. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have over 500 interviews. And if you like us, you can like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.